What these veterans did today crossed a line that the defense establishment had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the American public did not hesitate. They responded with shock, with anger, and with a demand for answers that Washington is still scrambling to provide, because the men and women who carried rifles, who drove armored vehicles through burning cities, who held dying friends in their arms in the dust and chaos of the last war, those men and women are now standing before cameras, before congressional panels, before the American people, and what they are saying is chilling. For months now, there had been rumblings, not from official Pentagon briefings, not from White House press conferences, just rumblings that veterans of recent conflicts were preparing something unprecedented. These veterans have been quiet, yes, but they have been deliberate in their quiet. Their silence has followed a certain discipline, a restraint, almost a code. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this spring was that the discipline went silent. Intelligence community observers who monitor veteran advocacy networks and military forums know the indicators. The uptick in private group communications, the sudden coordination between retired officers across service branches, the formation of informal coalitions with no public-facing leadership, the sudden disappearance of vocal critics from social media, not because they were silenced, but because they were organizing. All of that went quiet, and whenever veterans go quiet, it means something is about to get loud. These are not conspiracy theorists. These are not disgruntled former employees of the military-industrial complex looking for attention. These are Purple Heart recipients, Bronze Star holders, men and women who served multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and locations still classified. They saw things, they did things, they survived things. And now, after years of therapy, years of reintegration, years of trying to forget, they are choosing to remember publicly. The question Washington should have been asking wasn't why they were speaking now, it was why they had been silent for so long. Early this month, investigative journalists at several major outlets detected what they described as a coordinated disclosure effort by former military personnel, including testimony and documentation that had not been shared publicly in over 15 years. These are the kinds of first-hand accounts that the defense establishment only acknowledges when they are signaling something very specific, a reckoning, a course correction, or a warning. Reporters didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the veteran community was changing posture. And when combat-hardened soldiers shift posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the national security establishment pays attention. The veterans began with a simple, devastating claim. The lessons of the last war were not learned. The mistakes that cost thousands of American lives, tens of thousands of civilian lives, and trillions of taxpayer dollars are not only being repeated, they are being institutionalized. Retired Colonel Marcus Hale, who commanded an infantry battalion in Fallujah, told one interviewer, "We didn't just fail to learn. We built systems designed to prevent learning. We promoted the people who got it wrong and sidelined the people who got it right." Retired Staff Sergeant Diana Reyes, a combat medic who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, was even more blunt. They are planning to send the next generation into the same meat grinder. And this time, the meat grinder is smarter, faster, and hungrier. The statement issued by the Veterans Truth Coalition tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Veteran after veteran, in recorded testimony after closed-door briefing, described the current trajectory of American military strategy as reckless, uninformed, and perhaps most importantly, disconnected from the reality of modern warfare as experienced by those who have actually fought it. But institutional dismissal only works if the whistleblower hesitates. These veterans did not. In fact, their collective response today was among the most organized and devastating public challenges to military leadership we've seen in a generation. Here's what we know. Within 72 hours of the coalition's formation becoming public, veterans released detailed after-action reports, personal journals, helmet camera footage, and internal communications that contradicted official narratives about key operations in the last war. These weren't the sanitized summaries filed for congressional review. These were raw, unedited battlefield accounts, documents and recordings that veterans had kept in personal archives, waiting for the moment when speaking the truth might actually matter more than protecting the institution. They detailed failed intelligence assessments that were ignored. They revealed supply chain breakdowns that were covered up. They exposed rules of engagement that put American soldiers in impossible situations while protecting political narratives back home. And they named names. Tonight, multiple news organizations confirmed that the Veterans Truth Coalition released testimony covering operations across 12 conflict zones, including a classified forward operating base in eastern Syria that had recently been redesignated for what analysts believe was a new forward deployment initiative. The veterans spoke before Pentagon leadership could mount a counter-narrative. They addressed the intelligence failures in Mosul. They detailed the equipment shortages in Helmand province. They exposed the communication breakdowns between special operations units and conventional forces that were likely contributing to friendly fire incidents that were officially attributed to enemy action. In other words, these veterans targeted the architecture of institutional deception, the infrastructure that would have allowed the same mistakes to go operational in the next conflict. This is what made the coalition's warning so urgent. The military establishment's current strategic posture wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of institutional momentum that could send another generation to war under false assumptions if left unchecked. And the veterans, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't leak classified material that could endanger active operations. They didn't target individual soldiers or junior officers who were following orders. They hit the decision-making frameworks. They hit the promotion pipelines that rewarded conformity over competence. They hit the budget allocations that funded weapon systems designed for the last war while ignoring the tools needed for the next one. Retired Master Sergeant James Okafor, who spent 22 years in Army intelligence, put it this way: "We're not trying to burn down the house. We're trying to show you that the foundation is cracked. And if you build another floor on top of a cracked foundation, the whole thing comes down and on the people inside." And here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. Defense analysts now believe that the military's current strategic pivot toward great power competition was designed to test the institutional memory of the armed forces after years of counterinsurgency fatigue. Pentagon leadership wanted to see whether the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan would fade, whether veterans would remain silent, whether the public would move on. But instead, the opposite happened. The veterans didn't fade. They organized a response that was so thorough, so meticulously documented, that even senior defense officials noticed. You don't get the Pentagon's attention easily, but today, these veterans did. Military historians speaking with national media under anonymity described the institutional pivot as strategic amnesia, a way to reset the narrative and prepare the public for the next conflict without accountability for the last one. But the veterans proved today that they remain both vigilant and credible. Their disclosures were not only comprehensive, they were corroborated so precisely that multiple claims matched classified assessments that had been independently obtained by journalists through Freedom of Information requests. That corroboration matters because it shows that the veterans aren't guessing, they aren't speculating, they aren't exaggerating. It shows that the veteran community is not a passive collection of former employees. They are an active, informed, and deeply motivated network of witnesses who refuse to let the truth be rewritten. Retired Brigadier General Patricia Sato, who commanded logistics operations across 3 theaters, said something that stopped every journalist in the room. "I didn't speak up 10 years ago because I thought the system would correct itself. It didn't. It got worse. And now I have grandchildren who are approaching draft age. That changes the math." As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the veterans' coordinated disclosure. Former Special Operations personnel carried out a media blitz across 6 major networks simultaneously, forcing newsrooms to cover the story before it could be buried. Former military intelligence officers targeted assessment methodologies that had been quietly revised in the last 3 years to downplay operational failures. Former combat engineers operating through veteran advocacy channels reportedly released infrastructure assessments used by the military to justify base construction contracts that veterans on the ground knew were unnecessary and dangerous. This wasn't just a press conference. This wasn't just a petition. This was a coordinated information campaign. This was institutional accountability delivered from the ground up. And institutional accountability is the one thing the defense establishment has struggled to maintain since the wars began. For every narrative they have constructed, the veterans have countered with firsthand testimony that unravels it. For every official report that declares mission success, a sergeant who was there stands up and says, "That's not what happened." Remember, the defense establishment thought the veterans would accept their benefits and stay quiet. They thought the public would grow tired of war stories and stop listening. They thought the political class would protect the institutional narrative because their careers depended on it. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Veterans are louder than they've been since Vietnam. The public is listening with an intensity that has crashed servers hosting the coalition's testimony. And politicians on both sides of the aisle are scrambling to get in front of the story before it gets in front of them. One retired Navy SEAL speaking at a town hall in Virginia said, "We were told our sacrifice mattered. Then we came home and watched them plan the next war using the same playbook that got our friends killed. At some point, silence becomes complicity." What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that the veterans' warning happened at a time when Pentagon leadership is under enormous strategic pressure. Hawks in Congress want expanded military presence in the Indo-Pacific. Defense contractors want next-generation weapons platforms funded immediately. Allies in Europe want reassurance that American commitments remain firm, and the intelligence community wants expanded authority to conduct operations in gray zone conflicts that blur the line between peace and war. Pentagon leadership is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing the most complex geopolitical environment since the Cold War. And when institutions in that position make sudden strategic shifts, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. And the veterans know this. They've seen it before. They recognize the pattern, the rhetoric, the budget justifications, the threat inflation, the quiet movement of assets to forward positions. Retired Army Captain David Chen, who lost both legs to an IED in Kandahar, was the most direct of all. "I know what it looks like when they're getting ready. I've seen the machine warm up. It's warming up again, and no one who's actually been through it is asking for it." The Pentagon's official statement, now circulated to every major news outlet, was designed to signal that military leadership is not willing to allow the narrative to be defined by critics outside the chain of command. Officials said plainly that the veterans' disclosures were inconsistent with the established process for addressing operational concerns through proper channels. That is bureaucratic language for, "We don't want this conversation happening in public." You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake. They could have ignored it. They could have called it old news. Instead, they responded within hours. And that response told us more about the truth of the veterans' claims than any official document ever could. Meanwhile, the Veterans Truth Coalition spokesperson, retired Lieutenant General Robert Avery, addressed the American public in a measured, devastating speech tonight. He said, "We did not survive those wars to watch in silence as the conditions for the next one are manufactured." He said, "Every flag-draped coffin that came home was supposed to mean something. If we don't speak now, it meant nothing." And he said, "We are not anti-military. We are the military. We are the ones who bled. And we are telling you, the American people, that what is being planned does not match what is being promised. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a community that understands just how high the stakes have become because they've already paid the price once." Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The veterans' warning wasn't isolated. Along with the primary disclosure campaign, allied veteran organizations in the United Kingdom also released parallel assessments challenging NATO operational planning. Former intelligence operatives from 3 allied nations published a joint letter questioning the reliability of threat assessments being used to justify force posture changes, and cybersecurity experts with military backgrounds increased public warnings targeting the vulnerability of military communication systems to adversarial disruption. All of this happened within the same 2-week period. When veterans across multiple nations move multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the veterans are preparing a formal legal challenge to specific defense procurement decisions they believe are designed to enrich contractors rather than protect troops. Another is that the coalition is attempting to influence upcoming congressional hearings on defense authorization with testimony that directly contradicts official Pentagon assessments. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that the veterans are attempting to trigger a full-scale public reckoning with the institutional failures of the last 20 years of American warfare before the next conflict begins. But today, the veterans took the option of silence off the table. They didn't file quiet complaints through internal channels. They didn't write polite op-eds in policy journals. They didn't wait for permission from anyone in the chain of command. They spoke directly to the American people with evidence, with names, with dates, and with a moral authority that only comes from having been there. What we're watching now is a test of democracy itself. The defense establishment wants to see whether the public will defer to institutional authority. The veterans want to show that institutional authority must be earned, not assumed. Congress wants to prevent a political crisis that could upend defense budgets and election narratives, and the American people want to prevent their sons and daughters from being sent into another war built on lies. Tonight, we've heard from congressional staffers who are now reviewing the veterans' testimony in closed sessions. They say the documentation is extensive and in several cases directly contradicts sworn testimony given by senior officials in prior hearings. They say multiple veterans have agreed to testify under oath if subpoenaed. And they say the coalition's decision to go public is likely part of a broader strategy intended to create a permanent record that cannot be classified, redacted, or buried. But the Pentagon is not retreating. In fact, the Pentagon is mobilizing its own communication apparatus to challenge the veterans' credibility. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and aggressive, sent a message to the veterans that the institution will defend itself, and it sent a message to Congress that choosing sides in this fight will have consequences. As the weeks go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the defense establishment hoped to achieve by ignoring these warnings for so long. But what we do know is that the veterans' decision to speak was timely. It forced a national conversation that was long overdue. It provided evidence that may reshape congressional oversight of military operations. And it reminded every American that the people best qualified to warn us about war are the people who have fought one. What happens next will depend on what the Pentagon does in the next 30 days. If they engage with the veterans' concerns honestly, this moment will be remembered as a turning point in civil-military accountability. If they choose suppression, the veterans have already shown they are prepared for that fight too. They have shown they are ready to respond because they've already fought the hardest battle any human being can face, and they survived. And tonight, for the first time in 20 years, the Pentagon appears to be on the defensive, not against a foreign adversary, but against the men and women it trained, deployed, and then forgot. Washington is quiet tonight, too quiet. And when Washington is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, the defense establishment learned something it should have learned a long time ago, that the people who fight the wars remember what really happened. That silence is not consent, and it is patience. And that when veterans speak, the ground beneath every institution that failed them begins to shake. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The veterans are no longer waiting for permission to tell the truth. The American people are no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. And the next chapter of this reckoning will be written not by generals, not by politicians, not by defense contractors, but by the men and women who carried the weight of war on their backs and are now standing tall enough to demand accountability. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. Stay with us.